Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to join us today. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research. It's my great pleasure today to welcome back Dr. John Harvey to speak with us on the subject of nuclear modernization with a new president and Congress, continued bipartisan support or not. As many of you know from around the lab and the broader nuclear policy community, there are few people better qualified to speak on the subject than John, given his decades of experience on the subject, both in his government career and his consulting work since leaving government in 2013. So I expect the question and answer session to be robust, given the audience and the timeliness in the topic. But I just want to make a few sort of scene-setting remarks in opening. This notion of bipartisan support or bipartisan consensus on nuclear modernization gets thrown around a lot in statements and articles, almost as if it's a comforting mantra that if you say it enough times, it sort of wills it into existence and then maintains its existence in perpetuity. So as an outsider, you see the term a great deal, and you get perhaps two mistaken impressions from its usage. First, you think of the idea of a consensus as sort of a Boolean data type. Consensus either exists or it doesn't exist. It's black or it's white. But you go below the surface, and I think Dr. Harvey will take us there on his talk today, and you see a huge number of shades of gray on this subject that have to be constantly monitored for shifts and changes. You can have consensus on one nuclear program, but not another. You can have varying degrees of consensus on a particular program. You can think you have consensus on a program only to see something traded away for other legislative, policy, or defense spending priorities. And so much of a consensus, where you think the shade of gray is dependent on people and personalities in both the executive and legislative branches who are always changing. On the policymaking side, you have new sets of priorities, you have new people trying to get what they want in new ways, and those people may or may not mesh well with members and staffers. And the policy community comes into contact with a Congress that's also always in flux. When members of Congress come in or depart, or committee chairpersons change, committee members change, or even senior committee or personal staffers change, there are little tectonic shifts that you have to always be looking at to see, how the shade of gray in this subject is getting lighter and darker. Second, another mistaken impression you might get is that consensus is sort of simple to achieve and simple to lose. You have a big agreement linking arms control and modernization, boom, consensus on the triad. You try to do something too new, so boom, you lose consensus. But again, and I think we'll get into this a bit today, consensus is a very complex formulation that comes with a huge amount of behind-the-scenes work and monitoring. It requires constant maintenance and care, and a lot of time is spent by administration officials and their subject matter experts, going to the Hill, making their case in open and closed hearings, in meetings with members and staffers. And a lot of time goes on behind the scenes, tracking the budget process through the committees, writing the administration on the markups, attempting to divine the auguries you see in the questions for the record you get, in the tone of a hearing you sit in, or the public remarks you read as to where things are headed with Congress. So, this talk could not come at a more opportune time, coinciding with the new administration trying to staff up its ranks, getting prepared for its posture review. At the same time, you see sort of the wave of nuclear modernization funding beginning to be seen from the bow of the budgetary ship. And there's a fair amount of shuffling in Congress as well as they get ready to sort of tackle these issues. So we have the perfect speaker for that with John today. And I'm sure this will be an interesting talk. Just a quick reminder on protocol. John will speak here for about 30 to 45 minutes. His remarks will be recorded and likely will be posted on the CGSR website for future viewing. Once he's done with his prepared remarks, we'll open up to questions and answers for the remainder of the program. That content will be off the record and not for attribution. As he's speaking, please feel free to submit your questions electronically to myself or Katie Thomas at any time during the presentation, or raise your hand electronically. If you do raise your hand, be sure to be ready to jump in. When you're called on, Katie will jump in and unmute you so we can get as many people in the conversation as possible. So, John, thank you again for joining us, and over to you for your presentation. You're muted, John.
Hear me? 1, 2, 3.
Yes, John, thank you.
Okay, sorry. I've spent 12 wonderful years early in my career here at Lawrence Livermore, and I hope at some point when you guys start taking people back in person that you'll invite me back out so I can spend some time visiting old friends. Today, from a former physicist who has spent the majority of his career focusing on technical aspects of the U.S. nuclear stockpile, you're going to get a dose of nuclear policy. Ash Carter once remarked to me when he was Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition under President Obama, and also chair of the Nuclear Weapons Council, and also my boss, something along the lines of, quote, policy schmolicy. What really matters is getting our products out the door on time and under cost. Now, this, by the way, was after Ash had served at least 4 years in the Clinton administration as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. Yes, policy. And he was again at that time my boss. By products, he was referring to nuclear warheads, delivery systems, and associated command and control. So bear with me for a few minutes today on nuclear policy. But for all of you scientists and engineers, beware, I may throw in a technical idea or two, which I am open to being criticized for. And yes, and you can criticize my policy. I'm not an unobjective person on maintaining a consensus for our modernization program. I have a view, but I'll try to present the other sides of it in the Q&A session. My remarks address the following questions. Katie, can you go to the first chart? I don't have many charts here today, but there were so many lists of things that I decided to write them down just so you guys could have something to look at. What have been the common elements of U.S. nuclear policy over decades? What nuclear deterrence and arms control policies are needed to support this strategy? What will be Mr. Biden's nuclear strategy once his review of nuclear posture is completed? What should it be? What will be the impact of any policy changes to continued bipartisan support in Congress and the American public for nuclear modernization? I conclude with 4 arguments that could arise in the upcoming debate on U.S. nuclear posture. In setting the stage for this discussion, it's important to remember the past lessons learned. The end of the Cold War was followed by nearly 2 decades of confusion and divisive debate over the post-Cold War role and mission of nuclear weapons. Some may recall the Modern Pit Facility, the CMRR, Nuclear Weapons Advanced Concepts, the Robust Nuclear Earth Penetrator, the Reliable Replacement Program, mostly all solid programs, all killed by Congress. Overdue modernization was further stalled as a result. At least one member of Congress, and I should say that she comes from the district represented at your lab, the late Ellen Tauscher, told us what was needed. And I quote, "Our strategic posture should place the stewardship of our nuclear arsenal, non-proliferation programs, missile defenses, and the international arms control regime into one comprehensive strategy that protects the American people." And when she said that, the first time I heard that, it hit me in the head like a hammer. And it's been my mantra for most of my remaining years since I've heard it. At her initiative, at Ellen Tauscher's initiative, near the end of George W. Bush's second term, Congress established the Bipartisan Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States, the so-called Perry-Schlesinger Commission, to seek a path out of the mess we were in. Despite a spectrum of commissioner views bracketed by Johnny Foster on the right and Mort Halpern on the left, Bill Perry and Jim Schlesinger, with timely interventions from Ellen, were able to establish overall consensus. Their work was exploited extensively by Mr. Obama's team, many of whom, including Ellen, were drawn into his administration from the commission process to help craft this Mr. Obama's comprehensive strategy. The Biden administration should heed her sound advice. And again, let me continue on. Certainly, Mr. Obama did heed her advice. Early in his second term, in part due to Mr. Putin's reckless behavior, including Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, Obama moved out aggressively on nuclear modernization. He had set the stage for this in his 2010 NPR. As part of Ellen's comprehensive strategy, Obama had packaged modernization, important to the right, with items important to the left, including his giving voice to a long-term aspiration for eliminating nuclear weapons, but he cast this not necessarily in his lifetime, a commitment to avoid, if possible, programs involving new warheads or fundamentally new military capabilities, moving forward to conclude a New START treaty with Russia, exploring opportunities for further reductions, potentially to 1,000, and expanded cooperative threat reduction. This was his comprehensive strategy. This placed him in a very strong political position to advance an extensive modernization program touching every leg of the Triad and receive as well strong bipartisan support for it from Congress. Katie, can we go to the next chart? As we heed Ellen's strategy and her advice, that it is simply more than the nuclear forces piece, what indeed are the elements of a nuclear strategy? Well, a strategy must first answer the question, what are nuclear forces intended to deter and how? A strategy must establish the size and composition of forces to achieve deterrence objectives. It must develop an overall approach to extending deterrence to European and Asian allies if that's decided to be desirable, which many administrations and many presidents have said it is. It must address declaratory policy, and by this we mean what we say about the circumstances under which the United States might consider or would not consider employing nuclear weapons. It must address planning and targeting, alert posture, operations, training, and exercises. It should have an element of what we call signaling, and by this we mean options, and I mean not just words, but options, actually deployment options, for conveying to an adversary that certain actions jeopardize vital national security interests in ways that could provoke a nuclear response. Hedging. This is the ability to adapt the force and maintain deterrence to unanticipated technical problems with a warhead or delivery system or to geopolitical reversal. Part of our nuclear strategy has to be address how do we hedge. And finally, it has to address sustainment and modernization of the force. And sustainment is critical because we must ensure that today's nuclear triad, its dual capable fighter bombers and associated NC-2 nuclear command and control remain operational until modern replacements are available. It's a critical point. Katie, let's go to the next chart. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time just telling you, I'm going to remind many of you, but I'll tell some of you how extensive this modernization program is that we have underway. Well, the first part is the DoD piece. Well, the DoD piece is, we got to modernize the sea-based deterrent with a new Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine, which will replace the aging Ohio-class submarines that have been deployed since the 1980s. We need to develop a follow-on ICBM. We call this the ground-based strategic deterrent to replace the aging Minuteman III. We're planning to field a new B-21 strategic bomber. We're going to field a long-range standoff missile to replace the current air-launched cruise missile that is deployed with B-52. We plan to meet deterrence commitments to allies by developing a nuclear-capable F-35 Joint Strike Fighter and to be deployed with a life-extended B-61-12 bomb. The plan is to develop and field in the next decade a nuclear-armed SLCM. And very importantly, and sometimes underemphasized, our plan is to field the next generation, when I say our, I mean the Department of Defense, plan is to field the next generation nuclear command and control system that is responsive to both advancing threats and the emerging vision for modern conflict. For NNSA, next chart, please, Katie. For NNSA has two pieces, warheads and infrastructure. Our plan is to complete on time 5 warhead life extension programs for the B-6112 bomb, the W-76-1 SLBM warhead, which has now completed, for the W-88 SLBM warhead, an alt we call it, that will be underway shortly, and for the W-80-4 for the air launched cruise missile warhead that will be adapted for the long range standoff missile, and also for the W-78, a life extension for the W-78 ICBM warhead, and we call this life extension program the W-87-1. The plan was to field part of our modernization program for NNSA was to field a low yield warhead for the Trident D5 SLBM. That's completed, and that force is actually in the field under patrolling at sea. That capability. Our plan is to start work. Modernization program is to start work on the next Navy SLBM warhead. We call that the Mark 7 W-93. Lastly, with regard to warheads, is to advance concept and feasibility studies for a modern nuclear sea-launched cruise missile warhead. On infrastructure, next chart, Katie. We're carrying forward 9 large capital construction projects in various stages of execution. Among them is recapitalization of plutonium infrastructure to be able to produce plutonium pits at a rate of no fewer than 80 pits per year by 2030. We have a program underway, UPF, to restore safe, environmentally sound manufacture of highly enriched uranium parts at the Y-12 plant in Tennessee. Part of our recapitalization program is to ensure the necessary reactor capacity and availability of sufficient low-enriched uranium to produce tritium for nuclear warheads. We need to ensure the U.S. capability to develop and manufacture rad-hard electronics in a secure, trusted facility. All of these projects are moving forward simultaneously and are critical to our abilities to maintain and, if needed, modernize the deterrent. In addition to all the capital projects, we need to sustain the personnel, the computational, experimental, and test capabilities needed to assess annually the safety and reliability of the stockpile, and if necessary in the future, to design and field modern warheads for the force. Finally, and I think Lisa Gordon-Haggerty has done a wonderful job at this, is to continue the process of transforming the NNSA itself to become an efficient, cost-effective, organizational, coherent entity for working cooperatively with the Department of Defense to oversee the U.S. nuclear stockpile. Great progress is being made in that area, I believe. And actually, I'd like to hear your thoughts about whether that, from the lab perspective, whether great progress is indeed being made. Well, this is an extensive program. I've reminded some of you who are already intimate with it, and some of you may not be, but we're basically reproducing a triad simultaneously as part of a modernization program that will stretch out for 30 years. Next chart. I want to talk a little bit about continuity in U.S. nuclear strategy. And this is very important in connection with bipartisan consensus. The strategy that our forces are designed to support. Over decades, as reflected in the policy of at least the last 5 presidents, there has been a very large degree of continuity in U.S. nuclear policy. Specifically, deterring nuclear attack is the primary, but not the sole purpose of U.S. nuclear forces. Deterrence is based not on simply having nuclear forces, but on the ability of forces to hold at risk assets most valued by a potential adversary. Force size and capabilities thus matter and may be adjusted as deterrence needs evolve. Robust deterrence and indeed extended deterrence rely on a strategic triad of nuclear forces that will complicate enemy attack planning, and European basing of U.S. nuclear bombs carried by NATO dual-capable aircraft, including, as I pointed out earlier, the joint F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. A robust nuclear R&D industrial base, once achieved, will provide the ability for a timely response to unforeseen technical problems or geopolitical reversals. R&D and industrial base, a nuclear R&D industrial base that once achieved, and it's not yet been achieved, is a key part of our hedging strategy, from several past administrations as well. We've contained nuclear testing, continued moratorium, has met the policy, it has been a fundamental component of continuity in U.S. nuclear policy. And we've articulated traditional negative security assurances as part of our declaratory policy. Where are we after 8 years? Where are we today? But let me first start. Next chart, Katie. Where are we after 8 years of Mr. Obama? Well, he achieved the following. The Triad was reaffirmed at reduced force levels. New START was concluded and ratified at a numerical limit of 1,500 quote weapons. Follow-on assessments support reductions to 1,000 or so. Now, Mr. Obama made it very clear that this 1,000, we were not going to move to it unilaterally, but we would be willing to engage Russia in further discussions beyond New START to reduce to the 1,500 number to 1,000. There was vigorous internal debate on sole purpose and no first use, but both policies were rejected by the president. The Nuclear Security Summit process incentivized global action on residual nuclear risks. The JPCOA was concluded with Iran. There was an increased cabinet level focus on U.S. nuclear forces, particularly in light of Russia's reemergence as a threat to global security. Mr. Obama initiated a 30-year, $1.2 trillion nuclear modernization program for warheads, delivery systems, nuclear command and control, and NNSA's uranium and plutonium infrastructure, among others. He concluded his administration with strong bipartisan support established for his nuclear policies and modernization programs. Next chart. Where are we after 4 years of Mr. Trump? I characterize it in essence as continuity continued. The Triad was reaffirmed at New START force levels. There was some increased focus on the role of nuclear forces in U.S. security. Declaratory policy was further elaborated. For example, Mr. Trump's team clarified what is meant by non-nuclear, or clarified the term non-nuclear strategic attack. And by that we mean the circumstances other than nuclear attack that could warrant a potential U.S. nuclear response. Mr. Trump's team rejected sole purpose and no first use. It fully adopted Obama's modernization program with two modest adjustments, and they call them supplemental programs. And these programs were initiated. One of them was the low-yield Trident warhead, and the other was the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. These programs were implemented, and the major driver for these programs was the fact that Russia's behavior had changed significantly since the 2010 review carried out by Mr. Obama. On Ellen's comprehensive strategy, it's been a mixed bag. Let me just make a few points. Mr. Trump's team showed overt skepticism about Mr. Obama's long-term goal of a nuclear-free world. But New START continued under Mr. Trump. A new trilateral approach to Russia was proposed, and on arms control to Russia and China, a trilateral approach. So far, that's been unproductive. There was spectacular engagement with the North Korean leader on nuclear weapons, also so far unproductive. The U.S. withdrew from the JPCOA, and there was seemingly a reduced emphasis on countering nuclear terrorism and on the other types of threat reduction activities that Mr. Obama emphasized. There were some innovative approaches on non-proliferation diplomacy coming out of Chris Ford at the State Department. Mr. Trump continued the moratorium on nuclear testing. End result, even with this mixed bag, is that he retained bipartisan support for nuclear policies and modernization. Okay, Katie, we can dispense with the charts for now, and I don't think I have any more. I guess you can put me up on the screen if people can't see. What do I want from Mr. Biden's NPR? Or better said, not what I want. What might we expect from the nuclear review to be conducted by the Biden team? Well, here's what I'd like, and here's what I think we might expect to see. I'd like him to affirm the changed security environment. That is, the threat has evolved significantly since 2010. I'd like him and his team to affirm key elements of U.S. long-term nuclear policy and posture that I referred to earlier, the continuity over many, many presidents and administrations. We should anticipate an internal view and subsequent extensive debate on a number of issues, including GBSD, PITS, low-yield Trident, nuclear command and control, and others. I hope that Mr. Biden will continue, in essence, Mr. Obama's, I actually call it, in a sop to bipartisanship, I call it the Obama-Trump modernization program, and he should increase focus on nuclear command and control. He should engage with Russia and China in arms control and strategic stability, but not together. I don't think that's wise. I'll say more about that. He should renew nuclear security summits to address the post-Cold War nuclear risks. I believe I would like the team to identify and advance elements of what I would call a CTR 3.0. I expect him to, and I believe it's prudent that he reinstate and reaffirm the JPCOA, and I anticipate a robust non-proliferation agenda. Well, what might we get? What are some of the things I might not wish to have come out of the Biden review? Adoption of sole purpose or no first use. Again, we'll talk more about that. Slowing down GBSD and plutonium pit manufacturing capability, and reversing the low-yield Trident deployment. I don't think they will happen, but I have some concerns here. Regarding arms control, Mr. Biden in his first week in office agreed with Mr. Putin to extend New START. This, in my view, was a no-brainer. Not necessarily for its purported benefits for strategic stability, of which there are some, or for its role in advancing U.S. non-proliferation goals, which I think is highly arguable, or to assure allies, which I think is valuable. I think arms control can do that. And for the transparency it provides each other's nuclear weapons programs, which is highly useful. Rather, the most important benefit is to foster continued bipartisan support for the modernization. More generally, I expect that Mr. Biden will go further than Mr. Trump to advance Ellen's comprehensive strategy, so necessary, many of us believe, to ensure continued bipartisan support. Another recent indication of Mr. Biden's approach to nuclear weapons is in his adjusted FY22 budget request released just last week. It laid out top-line numbers, but did not allocate specific funds to specific program activities. His budget summary noted that the following with regard to DoD's nuclear weapons activities. This request, and I quote, maintains a strong, credible nuclear deterrent for the security of the nation and U.S. allies. While the administration is reviewing U.S. nuclear posture, the discretionary request supports ongoing modernization programs while ensuring that these efforts are sustainable. Regarding NNSA's nuclear weapons program, the request, again I quote, supports a safe, secure, and effective nuclear stockpile and a continued modernization program that includes the recapitalization of NNSA's physical infrastructure and essential facilities to ensure that deterrence remains viable. Bottom line, good news so far from the Biden team. Can we count on continued support as the Biden administration and the Democrat-controlled Congress ramp up activities on the FY22 and FY23 budgets? I am sort of a glass half full guy, so let me touch on a few points about why I am optimistic. First, Secretary of Defense Austin, notwithstanding needed schooling on nuclear issues, very importantly reiterated in his testimony words from the past two presidential administrations along the lines that nuclear deterrence is DOD's job number one. Kath Hicks, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, indicated strong support for the Triad in her confirmation hearings. Just to show you how careers evolve, when I was in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces, not the Obama, the Clinton administration under Ash, Kath Hicks was a PMI in my office. Her career skyrocketed. Yours truly sort of went on a little bit more of an even keel. But Kath indicated strong support for the Triad in her confirmation hearing. If Mr. Colin Kahl is confirmed, and that's by no means assured, he's the nominee for Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and he has would have a large role in any nuclear review. He's a pragmatic guy and a centrist in my view. DASD Leonor Tamero, the replacement for Rob Sufer, while perhaps not a student of the Frank Miller, John Harvey, Keith Payne, Brad Roberts, Elaine Bunn, and Rob Sufer School of Nuclear Policy, has been an influential staffer on a House Armed Services Committee that sustained nuclear modernization programs over 6 years and 2 presidents. Senator Jack Reed, Democrat from Rhode Island, and Jim Imhoff, Republican from Oklahoma, will reverse their roles as chair and ranking member of Senate Armed Services. With able support from key staff such as John Epstein and Adam Truel, they are likely to continue in lockstep their bipartisan approach to modernization. Senator Angus King from Maine, an independent who sits with the Democrat caucus, and Deb Fischer, Republican senator from Nebraska, both advocates for modernization, have become chair and ranking member of the Strategic Subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services. And they are likely to continue that bipartisan tradition. Representative Adam Smith, senator from Washington, Democrat from Washington, who is the chair of House Armed Services, has stated a strong commitment to deterrence and espoused a realist view that Congress supports vigorous modernization, and he has more to gain by seeking to shape rather than disrupt it, in my view. Representative Mike Rogers from Alabama, Republican, highly competent and knowledgeable about nuclear and space issues, is an apt replacement for Mac Thornberry, who was the ranking member on House Armed Services. I believe that Representative Rogers will work effectively with Adam Smith on modernization. Representatives Jim Cooper, Democrat from Tennessee, and Mike Turner, Republican from Ohio, both strong advocates for modernization, are now the chair and ranking members, respectively, of House Armed Services Strategic Forces Committee. And Senator John Tester, Democrat from Montana, a strong backer of GBSD, is to chair the Senate Appropriations Defense Subcommittee. This is not to say, as Michael said earlier, that we should not expect significant debate in Congress on modernization programs. For example, in the run-up to passage of the FY20 National Defense Authorization Act, there were a few areas of contention both within the Democrat caucus and between the Democratic-controlled House and the Republican-controlled Senate. These involved, and let me just state what they were to remind you, whether to slow down GBSD by cutting its funding, whether to cut funding for 2 NNSA programs, Pit Production and the W87-1 that support GBSD, whether to field a low-yield Trident warhead for Trident, whether to proceed on a study for a new nuclear SLICM, whether to adopt a no first use policy, and whether to retire the B-83 bomb. The FY21 authorization appropriation bills have had even fewer differences. Both were passed by both houses of Congress. In them, all issues were resolved and nearly all associated funding was appropriated, consistent with the president's budget request. This is a real success story for bipartisanship. In the remainder of remarks, I focus on four arguments, some referred to earlier, that could arise in the upcoming nuclear reviews and related debate in Congress. Argument one, modernization costs too much. In 2017, the Congressional Budget Office estimated the cost of maintaining the nuclear deterrent and modernizing over 3 decades would total about $1.2 trillion, 2/3 of which would go to operate and sustain in-place nuclear forces, and about 1/3 to replace them. It is important to note that even if we were somehow able to cease all modernization, we would still spend $800 billion of the $1.2 trillion over 30 years simply to secure, maintain, and operate existing forces. But there is little to no flexibility to absorb further modernization delay without degrading nuclear deterrence in future years. As former Secretary Ash Carter said, either replace aging platforms and systems or remove them from service. There is no other choice. In any case, modernization will be attacked. And yes, $1.2 trillion over 30 years is not cheap. That said, the cost argument has not received much traction so far. Both the Obama and Trump administrations made clear that nuclear forces are Americans' national security job number one national security priority. Moreover, nuclear sustainment and modernization will continue and will consume less than 7% of the annual defense budget, declining to 3% as modernization winds down. Given its high priority, expressed by two very different presidents from two very different administrations, and the relatively small fraction of the defense budget consumed, most see modernization as both essential and affordable. Argument number two, we can delay GBSD. Some opponents of the GBSD program argue to cancel the program and not sustain the Minuteman III because deterrence can be assured with only the SLBM, submarine-based, and bomber legs of the Triad. They would argue we can get rid of ICBMs. Others do not necessarily oppose a Triad. Rather, they argue that GBSD can be delayed because alternatives exist to extend the life of Minuteman III. A triad of nuclear forces has been a bedrock of nuclear policy over 60 years and 12 presidents. Arguments in support are legion and will not be repeated here. Suffice it to say that Minuteman III life extension has been studied by several entities, including some outside the Air Force. They conclude that the system must be replaced and that life extending it would cost at least as much and likely more than the GBSD system itself. The solid rocket motor stages, which in previous Minuteman III life extensions have been washed out and repoured with new propellant, are simply not sturdy enough to accommodate additional such processing. New motor stages are needed, as well as numerous other modernization upgrades. Further studies are not going to change this conclusion. Today, there is strong support on both sides of the aisle in Congress for GBSD. As an example, only 2 other senators joined Senator Markey on his proposed legislation to kill GBSD and have the National Academy of Sciences commission a new study on Minuteman III life extension alternatives. Nor are those opposing GBSD drawing much support from other quarters. Arguments along the lines of, and I quote, if the ICBMs are simply a sponge, then age-degraded existing Minuteman IIIs can fill that role. We don't need to spend the dollars to replace them, unquote, which many see as not serious, don't help their case. And we can discuss the ICBM modernization debate in the discussion period if we want. Argument 3. If we delay GBSD, we don't need 80 pits per year by 2030. The debate over GBSD has touched 2 NSA programs that support GBSD. The W87-1, as I referred to earlier, which will be fielded with GBSD, and NNSA's efforts to restore pit production to produce new plutonium pits to ensure timely fielding of warheads for our ballistic missile force. During the Cold War, the U.S. was producing 1,000 to 2,000 pits per year, some years. Today, we can hardly produce any. Recapitalizing plutonium production infrastructure and increasing pit production capacity is essential for a modern nuclear deterrent. The current plan is to establish 30 pits per year production capacity at Los Alamos's PF4 facility by 2026, and second, to field at the former MOX facility in South Carolina an additional capacity of 50 pits per year, for a total of 80 per year by 2030. Opponents of expanded pit production pose a reasonable question. Why no fewer than 80 pits per year by 2030? Well, there are 3 reasons. Today, with a much smaller stockpile, known requirements for pit production 10 to 20 years out can be assessed and used to help size needed facilities. U.S. ICBM and SLBM modernization draw attention to 2 warheads, the W87-1 and the W93 for Trident. Each will require newly manufactured plutonium pits. You simply can't get around that. Second, many pits in our stockpile are aging and will soon approach their estimated minimum lifetime and will need to be replaced. Third, known production needs cannot be the sole sizing criteria for pit capacity. One must include some excess capacity for unknown contingencies, including unanticipated technical problems. For example, pits age out faster than we thought, or to adverse geopolitical change. For example, Russia breakout, requiring additional U.S. warheads in response. This is part of hedging. Thus, 80 pits per year is a judgment call and not one tied to locked-in requirements. 80 per year, by the way, is at the lower limit of my comfort level. The technical advantage of building and certifying new plutonium pits for the stockpile is daunting. When we last produced pits in quantity in the 1980s, we were able to qualify pit manufacture with underground nuclear tests. Today, production technologies and processes must be certified that will have some differences from technologies and processes qualified with nuclear tests. The challenge for stockpile stewardship is to assess those differences and that they will not degrade pit performance. I'm confident because the lab directors say they're confident that the stockpile stewardship program can meet this challenge. By no means, however, is it a slam dunk. Argument 4, adopt a no first use policy. Over the past few decades, the United States has weighed the risks and benefits to both its nuclear deterrence posture and its nonproliferation policy goals of renouncing first use of nuclear weapons in a conflict. Well-meaning supporters of no first use are taken with the simplicity of the idea and its potential for bolstering U.S. moral leadership in the world. After all, they argue, the United States has no intention of starting a nuclear war, so why not just say so? In Mr. Obama's 2010 review, and later near the end of his second term, as part of a mini nuclear review, a no first use pledge was considered. Both times, Mr. Obama rejected the policy. The 2018 NPR carried out by the Trump administration reviewed the policy and reaffirmed Obama's decision. There are 3 major risks to adopting a declaratory policy of no first use. The first is to deterrence. Adversaries, absent a fear of reprisal, could be emboldened to act against U.S. interests by pursuing what we call catastrophic non-nuclear attack. The second is to U.S. guarantees assurances to its alliance. If America adopts no first use, then allies could lose confidence in America's extended deterrence commitments. Now, there's been this substantial dialogue with allies about this particular point, in which many countries express concerns about no first use. Such lost confidence, if there is lost confidence, such lost confidence presents a third risk, a risk to non-proliferation. America's allies could be spurred to develop and field their own nuclear forces. The benefits of adopting a no first use pledge are few. Some see it as a way to signal to the world a reduced role for U.S. nuclear weapons in national security. Reducing that role, and hence the likelihood that the U.S. would ever have to resort to nuclear use, is a laudable goal advanced by the NPRs of previous presidents. The concrete security benefits that could justify accepting the risks of no first use policy, however, are not well understood, nor quantifiable, and so far have not tipped the scales towards adoption of this policy. 5 presidents who preceded Mr. Biden have reviewed and rejected a policy of no first use in light of the risks cited above. Those who support it must explain how specifically it advances U.S. security and explain as well what has changed for the better in the international security environment since 2010 that would cause this president or this Congress to change course. Opponents of modernization programs, and I've cited 4 arguments, are losing the debate so far. Those who oppose GBSD because they think we can stretch out Minuteman III a few more years, who don't believe we need to prove going forward with urgency on PITS, who question the need for the W93, who would advance no first use in U.S. declaratory policy, or who would undeploy the low-yield warhead for Trident, simply have not made compelling case for these actions to Congress or the American public. In the intellectual arena, they have come up short. In their appeals to Congress, rather than respond to solid arguments from those opposed to their positions, they typically ignore them. Members of Congress and staff see this and react accordingly. Because it is a critical piece of Ellen's comprehensive strategy, I conclude with some thoughts on arms control. Consideration should be given to renewed efforts to engage Russia on other initiatives that are in U.S. security interests, including reducing the large disparity in non-strategic nuclear weapons, reining in certain of Russia's exotic modernization programs, and a more productive dialogue on strategic stability. As Mr. Obama learned, this may turn out to be another dead end with Russia. Still, such efforts, even if unrealized, demonstrate good faith and, as a result, strengthen bipartisan support for our overall nuclear posture. It is unclear what is to be achieved by pressing China to join an arms control dialogue with the U.S. and Russia, as proposed in the previous administration. The U.S. has traditionally sought to avoid providing incentive for Chinese nuclear buildup, the so-called sprint to parity. It is simply not credible that by engaging China in trilateral arms control dialogue, the United States could somehow lock in the current disparity in forces. Much more likely, China would press for equal limits on forces, which of course would be opposed by the United States. The end result, deadlock, in itself could incentivize China's sprint. It makes much more sense to advance a dialogue with China on strategic stability, transparency, qualitative arms control, rather than to focus on numerical limits on forces. But let me conclude. Many of us take as a given that the Triad of U.S. nuclear forces helps prevent major wars and promote strategic stability among the major powers. But the set of exquisite capabilities that are reflected at this laboratory, the people who design, develop, secure, plan, operate, and maintain nuclear forces, and the associated R&D manufacturing operational infrastructure that supports this effort are no less a factor in assuring allies and deterring adversaries. Over the next 2 decades, this set of capabilities will be tested in various complex modernization programs that will involve the near simultaneous replacement of every leg of the aging triad, a major upgrade to the nuclear command and control system, and recapitalization of aging warhead production infrastructure. Many of you folks here who are listening to me today will make this happen. There is no activity more important for our country, and I wish you Godspeed. Thanks, and I'd be happy to hear your thoughts and discussion.